Hey, and thanks for tuning in again. This is a special inbound tech-bound episode that I shot with Christopher Penn. And in this conversation, we speak about anything artificial intelligence, the impact of AI on SEO, and of course, GPT-3. Christopher Penn is actually the co-founder and chief data scientist of Trust Insights. He's also the co-host of Marketing Over Coffee and 3 times IBM Analytics champion. I would really appreciate a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts, or a subscription to YouTube, and of course the TechBound newsletter so you don't miss any of this content in the future. Thank you very much and enjoy this episode with Christopher Penn. 3, 2, 1. Christopher Penn, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm going to plug your brain for so many things, but I wanted to start with GPT-3. So GPT-3 created this wave of fear that came crushing down on content marketers and SEOs when they saw what it could do a couple of weeks ago. And on the other end, many people were excited because it potentially takes off the weight of creating lots of boilerplate text. So I was curious, what is your take on the impact of, or the potential impact of GPT-3 on SEO and content marketing?
So I think it's probably important. Have you talked about GPT-3 yet on your show already? Do your listeners know what this thing even is?
Slightly, yes. I touched on it in a blog post, but I think as a quick explainer would be amazing from you.
Okay. So there's this group called OpenAI that creates these, among other things, lots and lots of different AI models. And an AI model is a fancy term for software, right? It's a piece of software. There's this general pre-trained transformer, GPT, family of models that this group has created. GPT-1, which was about 2 years ago, GPT-2, which was last year's, which has been used very heavily for natural language processing and natural language generation, writing net new code. And then this year, appropriately, the model is now version 3. Version 3 is a departure from the previous versions in that it now, instead of having lots of parameters and guardrails to generate text, it takes a prompt. So you'll say, you for example, write in a quarter of a paragraph, tell it how much content to create, and it will try and essentially guess at what the rest of the logical pieces of content should be. And it does some really cool things, one of which that I'm personally entranced by is called neural style transfer, where it is trained with something like how Ernest Hemingway writes. And then you feed it J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, and you say, rewrite Harry Potter in the style of Ernest Hemingway, and it will change the language structurally to do that. Now, there's some upsides and downsides with the way this new model works. Obviously, the big upside is that it requires a lot less prompting to use the actual model once you've trained it, and it's called priming. And it can do all sorts of very different pieces of tasks. It can write, for example, reasonably credible poetry. It can do regular text, marketing dreck. Marketing content's not always that exciting. Novels, things like that. It can also generate code. There were examples of it writing code from scratch, given a prompt. Say, like, I generate a window that has these 4 buttons, and it would write this in Swift was the language being used. Now, that all sounds cool. And as you said, some people very afraid, other people are very optimistic. Here's the downside. It's not really a downside. It's just knowing it. The limitations. Number one, this model is gigantic. It is 174 billion hyperparameters. And a hyperparameter is the best way I can explain hyperparameters and hyperparameter optimization is think about an oven, right? And you're baking cookies, right? You can put these cookies in the oven. And what are all the dials on the oven? There's things like time, there's temperature, there's convection, not convection. Each of those are parameters, and every degree from like 170, which is your oven's keep warm setting, to 800, which is clean. When you do hyperparameter optimization, you're essentially going to try and bake a cookie at every single possible device setting. And so this model has been taken the English language and I believe it's trained mostly on English, and has essentially tried to write 174 billion different ways, these hyperparameters tuned in order to generate text. That means that from a computational perspective, it is extremely expensive. It requires big hardware, big iron, lots and lots of GPUs. And the ability to use in a production capacity is going to be constrained by those resources. It's not going to be, you're not going to put this on your laptop and run it. Or you can, but you expect to wait a couple of years for some output. So that's one downside. And the second downside of this model right now, at least from the folks who have talked about it, and one of the things that early adopters have said is that it requires what's called a lot of pre-priming, a lot of giving it samples, a lot of very tuned text in order to know what to do. And that's, again, no surprise. Basic number one basic of machine learning is you've got to have good data to tune a model on. And the tuning process for this apparently is also very computationally expensive. So is it something that a content marketer or an SEO professional needs to be like, oh my God, tomorrow I'm out of a job? No, not even close. It requires a lot of expertise. It requires a lot of hardware, and it requires a very well-tuned data set to be able to generate the incredibly cool proofs of concept that have come out. But again, it's not something you're going to fire up a web browser and just say, okay, make me my next 1,000 blog posts. We're not there yet.
I read somewhere that the estimated cost of training that model is between $10 and $12 million. So an absolutely incredible effort needed. But where do you fall? Which side of the coin are you on? Are you more intimidated by what's possible already, what we see, or are you excited?
I am very much on the excited side of things, but also I am also very skeptical of a lot of the hype that has come around with AI in the last 2 years. And it's not because the technology is not there. The technology is absolutely ready in many cases for production. Some of the more advanced, but not like cutting edge models like the T5 transformers and even GPT-2 can do some pretty cool stuff, and they can generate state of the art results on a lot of different tasks. The challenge for a lot of AI and for a lot of AI companies in marketing in particular is, are they solving a problem that we actually have, right? Or are these solutions in search of a problem? Some things 100% are definitely a great solution to an existing problem. Using these natural language models, things for like question and answer with chatbots, perfect application, very useful, very well tuned, and can save companies a lot of time and money, and while still providing a great user experience. The user really feels like they're in a Turing test. Like, am I talking to a human or am I talking to a machine? I don't know, but the answers are pretty good. So there's that. But on the flip side, there's also a lot of stuff out there that really is just hype. There was a piece in the Financial Times. It's now about 1.5 years old. The Financial Times did an investigation of 100 different companies that said they were AI software companies, and found that 35% of them had nothing at all. They had outsourced it to like overseas work in like Bangladesh, which, yes, they're using human intelligence, which is still the state of the art. But they weren't living up to their claims. So I'm very much on the optimistic side. I write a lot of my own code. I build a lot of my own models and things for my work in marketing, and once you get into it, you realize there are many more limitations than you would, when you go to all the vendor websites, you're on the virtual trade show floor now, all these companies are making all these cool promises. And then when you get into the coding, you're like, oh, this is a lot harder than they made it look.
Yeah, it's just a very strong, sophisticated spreadsheet in some cases. But you also wrote a whole series on your blog called the AI-powered SEO process. Can you elaborate on that and tell us what it looks like?
So the AI-powered SEO process actually looks very much like the scientific method in a lot of places, but it is essentially, what data do you have that you can train on? What are the models you're going to select? What are the outcomes you're after? And then do you have the ability to generate the individual pieces using a couple of different techniques and tactics? A big part that I think is immediately useful to a lot of SEO folks is topic modeling, and topic modeling is well beyond proven now. It is old hat for a lot of more mature machine learning folks, but there's just so many good tools for doing topic modeling to be able to say, okay, I'm going to do a search for, I don't know, espresso shops near me, right? And you pull in the top content, or you use the SEO tool of your choice and pull in the top 100 pages on these things, and then maybe you pull another set of like the next 900, and then you do a split and say, okay, what do the top 100 pages have in common that is absent from the next 900? build two topic models, look at the intersection or look at the exclusions and say, okay, what's in common with these top pages? The other thing is that with tools, for example, Facebook's fast text, you can do what's called vectorization, which is where you turn words essentially into all these numerical vectors and say, what are the semantically related things that that will be associated with this? So I may have an espresso shop. I may or may not mention the word cold brew, right? But we know from how Google works with its own models that it is doing semantic association. So you may end up ranking for like a latte, even though you don't have a page on your website. This is all about our lattes. It's not there.
Right.
But Google understands from a semantic perspective, if you're an espresso shop, you probably have lattes. And so in a local search, you may come up for someone searching for latte near me. Using those topic models, using these techniques is a great way to start teasing that out and creating content that is logically that should be there based on the data that you're being given. It's not truly doing it because Google's models are much bigger, but it is kind of like reverse engineering a little bit of it just to understand what else should be in the content you're creating. So that's a big part of this process is doing inventorying what you have, inventorying what's in the top results, trying to figure out, again, what are the intersections, what are the places where you've got a gap. And then another one that I think is so overlooked is key opinion leader or influencer identification. It's still, for good or ill, inbound links are still the gold standard of what predicts, like, hey, this site's going to rank reasonably well. And while it has been proven time and time and time again that there is zero correlation between social media sharing and search rank, there is a logical relationship between getting an influencer to write a blog post about you and getting that link, right? So that's a part that I feel like so many SEO folks, particularly folks who are still stuck in like 2015, are getting wrong. They're just like, they're just spamming people like, please link to it. I've got this great resource, please link to it. As opposed to saying, okay, in this network of people who are expert about this topic, who are the network hubs? How do I approach them carefully, build a real relationship over time, and then can I get one piece of content placed with them somehow? Because I know if I do that, it will spread like a fire to the entire first and secondary connections that this person has. And that's a better model of doing this type of influencer outreach than, spamming everybody that you possibly can, which I still get like 40 of those a day.
Yeah. It's sometimes stunning how many of these old terrible habits are sticking in an environment that develops so rapidly and so fast. And I totally agree with you. I think, as SEOs, we're traditionally very bad at taking things to the next meta level, and instead we're often sticking to and trying to scale these old kind of terrible tactics. But in the realms of your AI-powered SEO process series, you created a simple k-means cluster based on your blog articles with 2 Moz metrics that basically show your most valuable content in a nutshell. And I'm curious, how can SEOs or basically beginners get started leveraging very basic machine learning models for their work? What's the entry point?
So on that particular example using k-means clustering, I don't do that anymore. That technique is very old now, and it's not as good as using Markov chain models.
Got it.
There's this concept, and this is, I think it's an important concept to understand. There was an archetypical story of a college that opened up its campus and didn't have any sidewalks and just let students wander randomly. And then a year later, paved sidewalks where all the paths were worn. And supposedly this campus, which has never been named, feels like a nice campus to wander. It feels very natural. That concept is still a great concept. And when you look at how people traverse your website, there are paths to conversion. There are logical places that people go on your website behaviorally that lead to conversion. So if somebody's on your site, they're on your blog, and then they go to your services page, and then they go to your about page, and then they go to your contact page, right? That's a path to conversion. And one of the things that people don't understand about attribution analysis is that you can perform the same thing you do to figure out like which channels work. You should be doing with your content, which of your content works. And it is absolutely possible to model that today with the data that you have in your existing web analytics tool, particularly if you're using Google Analytics. When somebody completes a goal in Google Analytics, and you can restrict this, like goals that had organic search as one of the drivers, if you want to focus it on SEO. Inside the API, there's goal conversion location. There's previous page 1, previous page 2, previous page 3. So you can see the three steps before a goal completion and the goal completion. Using this machine learning technique called Markov chain modeling, you can absolutely understand the importance of what pages are the most important in that sequence to goal completion. That tells you these are the pages on your site that you must optimize. You must have them not only tuned for SEO, but also tuned for conversion rate optimization to make sure, like, it may turn out this blog post that you wrote is just fire. It's on fire. Great. Optimize the heck out of it. Make sure it ranks for every term that you can possibly get it to rank for, but also put some budget towards promoting it, maybe even on the SEM side, because you need traffic to come to that page because that is the precursor to a conversion. And so that's not an easy starting point from a machine learning perspective, but it is the easiest starting point from a results perspective to be able to demonstrate the value of SEO. Hey, we're going to find the pages that already convert, and we're going to tune them up first. They are our priorities to take care of. If you want a place to start with machine learning, the simplest technique of all is linear regression. Right? It is technically machine learning, but most people would agree that, like, if you can do it in Excel, it's probably not machine learning. But looking at the data that you have in your analytics software and trying to assess what are the things that potentially lead to the outcome you care about. So I would say, if you want to get a head start, look at it at a page level from your Google Analytics data. And you can do this in Data Studio. You can do it from the API. I like to do it from the API because you can get more data out of it that way. Your pages, the organic searches per page, which is a metric that is in the API, super valuable. People miss it. Your sessions and your goal completions, right? And then do a multiple linear regression. Is there a relationship between, say, organic searches to that page and conversions? If there isn't, it means that your search strategy may be attracting searches, but it may be attracting searches from traffic that doesn't convert.
Right.
One of those things that SEO folks forget an awful lot is we're optimizing. We're trying to get top ranking positions and all this stuff, but are we getting a decent quality audience? I look in my Search Console data and I'm like, I'm getting a lot of traffic. There's like 3 or 4 times I'm getting a lot of traffic, but this is not what I'm about. This is not what I want to be known for. Like, should I just delete that post? Like, I don't know if it's worth having. But that simple regression analysis is a great starting place to say, how do I start to understand my data as it relates to SEO and give me some guidance about what I should be doing?
Right. And it's funny because I think that in some weird twisted way, Google kind of weeds out the bad audience for us ourselves by monitoring or by using things like user behavior signals, and in what capacity they do that and to what extent is still very debatable. But I totally agree with you. And I was wondering, I know that you're a master in R, and there's a hype that has been kicked off, I would say 6 to 12 months ago in the SEO scene about Python. Because I know this question will pop up, what tools do you recommend folks to use to get started with like simple linear regressions and then to expand from there?
So, okay. On the R versus Python thing, that I swear more than anything is an age thing. I'm old, right? I'm in my 40s. I was doing SEO when the search engine of choice was Yahoo directory and Alta Vista. I remember Alta Vista.
Right.
And so I grew up learning languages like C and Java and C++. And so our syntax is much more familiar and comfortable to me. I have a really hard time with Python syntax. I even have a hard time just understanding the stupid indenting thing. I'm like, why are we doing loops with indents? This is dumb. But that's me. I think the two languages, of the two languages, Python has much more general use. So for someone brand new who's never coded, I think it's probably a better choice. But I would encourage people to try both and see which one just feels better to you. Now, that said, do you need to program to do some of this stuff? No. as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm an IBM champion, and one of the tools that IBM has is a fantastic tool called IBM Watson Studio. Inside there is a drag and drop click based modeler where you put these little colored blocks, chain them together, and you can drop in like a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet and have it. You obviously have a graphical interface to push the buttons and things, but you can do a lot of these analyses, regression modeling, XGBoost, gradient boosting, clustering, all these statistical and machine learning techniques inside of a no coding environment. There are limitations to it, but as a beginner to intermediate, you're not going to hit those limitations for a long time. You're going to be learning the tools. And I think it's a really great way to try and learn the thinking without getting hung up on the code. What should I logically do? I should clean my data first. Okay, I'll use the data cleaning module. Should I figure out what data is important? Sure, use the feature selection module. And then what should I do next? Maybe I should try and do a numerical analysis. Okay, use the auto numeric block, and you chain 4 of these little colored blocks together, and it spits out a result. And like, okay, you were able to do that without coding, and I think that's a really, really good start. And if you go over to Watson Studio, it's sort of one of those sort of free to play things where you get a certain number of hours each month, and I think you're capped at 50 hours a month for free before you have to start paying for it. For a lot of the work that we're doing in SEO, 50 hours is more than enough to do some of these analyses. But more than anything, it's just to get your brain trained. Okay, this is how I should think about the process of processing my data for SEO purposes or anything, using machine learning techniques, but not necessarily having to sling code.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you for that. One person from your audience also asked, do keywords still matter in an AI SEO world? And I really liked your answer because you came back to a lot of these concepts that we touched on, like co-citation, entities, vectorization, and just the relationship between different entities. I was wondering, can you go a bit deeper into that? Can you elaborate on that?
I think if you understand the models that Google uses that they've publicly stated, you can start to tease out what is important to how they think about particularly text. One of the greatest misses I see in SEO is people not going to Google's academic publications page and reading their publications. There are hundreds of these things every year, and it pretty clearly tells you the direction that they're researching. Even if the research isn't in the product yet, it gives you a sense of, this is what they're thinking about. When they announced, for example, that for processing queries last year, they were starting to use their BERT model, the bidirectional encoding representation transformers. The first thing people are like, that doesn't matter to SEO because they're using it to just understand the context of the query. Like, well, it's a two-sided coin. Yes, you use BERT to understand the context of the query, but by definition, you kind of should run the same thing on your corpus so that you can do pairwise matching, which is something that Google says they do. It's like, okay, so BERT does matter for understanding and taking apart entities and context, prepositions, etc., on both the query side and on the result side. So why would you not take your content and run it through any of these transformers and understand what it is that they would see in your text? And so you should be analyzing your text for entity detection. Like, are there entities that are logical that should be in your content? At the end of the day, like you said earlier, when we're talking about behaviors and stuff, Google is fundamentally capturing and replicating human behavior, right? So the old advice from 20 years ago is still valid, right, for humans, right, as if there was no Google, so that people would say, wow, that was really good. I want to refer this to my friends. Because as Google's natural language processing technologies evolve, and the way they're doing their matching evolves, it's looking more and more like the kinds of things you would recommend to a friend anyway. Because again, they're copying our behaviors. That means if you don't have access to the state-of-the-art models, you can start to at least play with some of them. One of the greatest gifts Google has given us is Google Colab, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, is their machine learning laboratory. You can sign up for a free account, and you get a 4-hour working session. You can start a new one anytime, but after 4 hours, it times out and shuts down to save resources. And you can load up with their hardware, like Tesla K80s, GPUs and stuff. and you can run code in this environment, and you can load up things like the T5 transform, which is one of their big transform models. You load in your text and say, do some analysis with this, do some testing with this. One of the great techniques that their T5 transformer does is abstractive summarization. So put in, say, your blog post and say, transformer, read this, process it, and give me a 3-sentence summary of what you think this piece of text is about. And it will spit that out. Sometimes it comes out with salad, but sometimes it comes out with a really good summary. Well, guess what? If the T5 transformer in Google's environment, which is a Google-based transformer, spits this out as an abstractive summary of what it thinks your piece of text is about, what do you think that same transformer is doing for search results? Right? It's trying to understand, what is this piece of text about, and does it match these queries? By the way, if you want to, that's a fun tip. If you're doing meta descriptions or even just social media posts, stick through an abstractive summarization tool and get a 2 or 3 sentence summary. Those short summaries are so good. They go off the rails once you get beyond 1,500 characters, 1,500 words. But 2 or 3 sentences, they just nail it.
It sounds like something you could build into a headless CMS and just enrich your CMS.
You could. It's very cost intensive processing time wise. So like a blog post will take about 2.5 to 3 minutes to process, which is no big deal for one blog post. But if you got a bunch of users on a big CMS, you're talking like hours of compute time.
Right. You yourself mentioned an add-on for R that you use for natural language processing. I was just curious for the audience, what is that and to what extent to use it?
So there's a bunch, but the primary natural language one I use is called Quantata. It is an open source package, just like R itself is open source, and it does a lot of these things like basic term frequency and inverse document frequency scoring, which has been in use in SEO for 5 years now and is still relevant. But it also does things like cosine similarity, Euclidean distances, etc. One of the things that I'm playing with right now is this idea or this concept, and this is an old concept. This is from, I want to say, like the 60s or the 70s. But it's this concept called stylometry. Stylometry is a way of measuring how someone's writing style looks and then comparing it to other writing styles. Like, for example, Anne Rice has a very distinctive way of writing. Ernest Hemingway has a very distinctive way of writing. There's just ways they use words and phrases. And one of the things I've run into trouble with content curation for social media marketing is you'll find a lot of content that you share that it's not quite aligned with your brand, right? It just seems off. And so I'm using these natural language tools and trying to build some of this stuff right now to say, okay, not only do I want to share stuff that has like high domain authority and lots of organic traffic and stuff like that, but is it stylistically similar in tone to my own stuff, so that someone who's reading it my feed will go, oh, it makes total sense why Chris would share that, because it sounds just like him, or it sounds close topically and from a language perspective, it sounds like him. From an SEO perspective, this is a fantastic tool, a fantastic concept, I would say, for things like vetting guest writers, right? If you're trying to get a pool of, say, 150 guest writers, have them all submit a sample, it can be any existing sample, and run it through a stylometry tool with some of your posts and say, okay, which writers sound like us, so that we have a minimum amount of editing to do in order to get something that sounds like a polished product, as opposed to, I used to run a guest blogging program for a huge tech company, and some of the submissions we got, it's like the person was face rolling across the keyboard. I'm like, what happened here? And so these tools, and this one in particular are really good at doing those individual techniques. They're a lot like utensils in a kitchen, right? You have different tools for everything. It still needs you as the chef to understand what tools to use when and how.
And ultimately, we can probably even transfer someone's writing into the style that we want to without, having to analyze it in the first place.
Yes, and that's where that neural style transfer that in GPT-3 has real potential. Could I take a piece of content and rewrite it in my style? Now, that has some very, very interesting and thorny implications from a legal perspective, because the language it creates is net new language. If I take this model and say, GPT-3, ingest all of my blog posts, and now rewrite Harry Potter in my voice, it's going to sound very different. It's going to be net new language. Who owns that? right? And it is a derivative work. So under standard copyright law would follow it would qualify as a derivative work, but could you prove it? I mean, obviously, if the character is still named Harry Potter, you could. But if you did like a find replace, like E.L. James did with 50 Shades of Grey, which was originally a Twilight fan fiction. They really just did a find replace on the character names. It's no longer Twilight. It's now an independent work. It's the characters all still have essentially the same characteristics as the Twilight characters. So if I take something like Twilight and say rewrite it in my style, whose work is that? Because I didn't really write it; the machine did. It understood my style and it took a source material. This, for SEO perspectives, presents a very, very interesting challenge, because if you have an industry leader, like say in tech, like you have Cisco, right? And you can do an assessment of which of the best linked blog posts on Cisco's blog, and say you're Netgear. Cisco owns Netgear. Well, we'll just use it for an example. Say you're Netgear. Your Netgear's marketing team. What happens if you copy and paste Cisco's top 50 blogs, use a neural style transfer tool with your own stuff, and now you have 50 new blog posts that are exactly topically identical to Cisco's, but a unique new language? From an SEO perspective, you're probably going to do pretty well, because they're going to cover the same major points. But who owns that? Whose copyright is that? And what has happened? Can it be proved in a court of law? The answer is probably not.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It touches slightly on fake videos, like Obama saying things that was machine learning created, but then at the same time, I think, and it comes a little bit full circle to the fear that I mentioned in the first question, which is that, say we know the elements of a good story, for example, right, or several different story arcs and how they work and how popular they are. You could theoretically just take something like the hero journey, which is one of the most classical story arcs that exist, and just inject any topic on that and just keep churning out these amazing stories, right? And I think the underlying fear there is also to be redundant, because the machine gets so much better. And this might be future talk still, right? I don't think we're there, and this is something we established. But just the sheer thought of having these structures that we know work well, which we could have analyzed with AI in the first place to validate that they work well, and then using models to basically create our own from that. I think it paints a picture of a world that's a little sinister, but also a little bit exciting.
I would say, though, if you've ever intentionally or accidentally read a trashy romance novel, that is functionally exactly the same story in 100,000 different versions. Person meets person, person falls in love with person, strange conflict, person resolves with person, and off you go. That hasn't changed. If you read, for example, the Warriors series by Aaron Hunter, which is a young adult series, it's exactly the same story over and over again. It's a team of 5 writers. There actually is no Aaron Hunter. It's the same team of 5 writers, basically just recycling the same plots over and over again with different cats. And so people just inherently find value and comfort in repetition, in stuff that they already know. I mean, there actually is a term for that. I'm drawing a blank on what it is, but it is one of the reasons why you rewatch the same series you've watched on Netflix over and over again. Like, why are you still watching this thing? You know how it ends. People do it as a form of comfort, and certainly in as the beaten to death expression goes, in these unprecedented times, anything that reduces anxiety is a good thing. That said, one of the greater dangers that no one's talking about, and that is a problem in the tech industry and in the SEO industry, is that you need to have a very strong ethics foundation in order to use AI responsibly. That can be anything from the basics of, hey, are we pulling from enough diverse content sources, to who are we sharing? Do we have an implicit or an overt bias in who we share or who we link to how are we calibrating our marketing results on a representative audience? Should our audience be representative of the general population? And like, if you're a B2C marketer, the answer is probably yes. And if your audience is non-representative, you have to ask why. Is it in violation of the law? And even if it's not, is it the most profitable possible outcome? A real simple example of this is the one I give all the time about My Little Pony. So My Little Pony is a toy made by Hasbro Company, and it is ostensibly targeted towards girls 8 to 14 years old. if you train and all of your data and all of your modeling is based on that assumption, you're going to create models and content and all this stuff. But, and there's a Netflix special about this, there's an entire audience of men 26 to 40 who are rabidly in love with My Little Pony. They're called bronies. There's conferences and conventions, but guess what? They have way more disposable income than an 8-year-old. If you build your entire marketing strategy and your SEO strategy on this one bias you have of 8 to 14-year-old girls, you've missed a market opportunity, a lucrative market opportunity, and you have a real risk of not making as much money as you could have, whether it's for yourself, your company, whatever. But even in things like SEO, we have to be aware of, and we have to be constantly questioning, are we biased? Are we baking biases into our assumptions? Are we baking bias into our data sources when we build, keyword lists? Even something as simple as a keyword list. What language are you using? There's in linguistics this phrase. English is the language of privilege. Right? Is the language of rich people. And guess what? The majority of the planet doesn't speak it. If you're optimizing for your market, are you, by optimizing in English alone, intentionally ignoring potentially lucrative other markets? If you don't have an understanding of Portuguese, you could be missing all of Brazil. If you don't have an understanding of Chinese, you're missing 1.3 billion people. And so we have to constantly ask ourselves: are we optimizing? Are we doing SEO for assumptions that are no longer valid compared to the market we could have?
I love that point for two reasons. I'm going to tell why, Christopher. The first one is because when I worked at Atlassian, I actually met a brony, and I had no idea about what was going on. I normal guy, and he had his I think it was a developer, and his background, his laptop background, was My Little Pony, and I couldn't connect the dots for the life of it. So one day I asked him, "Dude, what's going on here?" And he was like, "Yeah, I watched My Little Pony." I was like, "Isn't that a kid's show?" And he was like, yeah. Well, and then he explained this whole concept of bronies and how huge it is. As you mentioned, it's a huge market, actually. It's very, very potent. And the second reason for why I love this is because I did a little bit of research. And in one of your most recent newsletters, you actually wrote about questioning your assumptions. And I'm going to read really quickly what you wrote. You said, as busy marketing professionals, we don't give ourselves enough time to study, research, investigate, and most importantly, challenge our assumptions. When we fail to do this, we operate under our old knowledge. And in a rapidly changing world, old knowledge is dangerous. How do you, in your daily work, question your assumptions?
There's two ways. One is I have obviously my own sets of checklists and things to ask myself, are these problems? And actually, if you want to get a head start on this, there's a great free book on Amazon called The Ethics of Data Science by Dr. Hilary Mason. I think it is mandatory reading for anybody who works with data in any way, shape, or form. It's totally free. It's not even Kindle Unlimited or anything. It's totally free. Go buy it and read it. Well, get it and read it. And two, I do a lot of content creation. Writing my newsletter is how I stay up to date, is one of my, quote, secrets, right? Because in order to curate content and stuff and build these newsletters, I have to read. I have to constantly be keeping up to date. Like, what's going on with this thing? I'm looking at my social feed for next week. And there's stuff in here like, I don't recall seeing that. I don't recall seeing that happening. I must have missed the news on this particular thing. And in doing that, it keeps me up to date, keeps me fresh and aware of what changes are happening. And because the input sources for a lot of the tools I've built are more diverse than just marketing blogs, there's a lot of other stuff that finds its way in here. Like there's a whole piece right now on measuring the temperature of meltwater as a proxy for understanding how quickly glaciers and polar ice caps are melting. Like, okay, that's cool. Can I find data on that? Maybe I should go explore that. On a Saturday night or whatever, just go play around and go, there might be something to this. SEO professionals, all marketing professionals, need to be dedicating time every single week in their work towards reading and researching, towards reading the top blogs in the field and reading the not top blogs, doing some digging around, looking at following reliable people on Twitter and seeing what they share. I think that's one of the things that, again, people forget is that it's when you follow somebody and they're sharing stuff, you're not following just the person, you're following their media diet. You're following what's important to that person. If you follow, Bill Slosky, and you follow Danny Sullivan, you follow I can't remember what's her name.
Alita Solis.
Yes, thank you. You follow all these folks, you see what they share. You start then reading their sources, and it helps you bridge out. It's kind of like how you find new music. A friend says, "Hey, listen to this song." You check out the song. You check out the band. You're like, "Oh, I like this band," and you start listen to all the new music and stuff. That's how you stay fresh. And it is more important than ever that SEO practitioners be doing this, because the underlying technologies that companies like Google are using are changing constantly. They're upgrading, they're doing new stuff. And if you're not following along, you're operating on techniques that may be counterproductive now. They worked 5 years ago, but they haven't worked in 3 years. And why would you keep doing something that doesn't work?
Yeah, those are fantastic experts. And it's funny that you mention forgetting and things that don't work, because you also wrote about this concept of everything decays in your newsletter. So you wrote everything decays, but in digital marketing, much of what we do every day decays a little. You experience it on a daily basis. Every email campaign that goes out has a few more non-working addresses. Every social media account gains and loses followers. Every piece of code and software grows a little more stale every day if it's not regularly maintained. And then you wrote the antidote to decay is not only maintenance, but the injection of new energy, new blood. An email list can be regularly maintained, but if you're not adding new subscribers, it will continue to shrink over time until it's a pale shadow of itself. The same is true of your social accounts, your CRM, your marketing automation software, everything. So explain to me what that means to you.
It means exactly what it said. It is that if you're not growing, you're receding. There is no such thing as standing still in marketing. There really isn't. From an SEO perspective, this. You know that if you're not getting new inbound links and your old links are decaying, you're going to lose ranking, right? It's as simple as that. What are you doing to keep growing? What are you doing to foster growth? And more importantly, to also the previous, what are you doing now to set the foundation for future growth? That's probably one of the greatest challenges people are not thinking about, is what are you doing today that won't pay dividends today? It won't pay dividends tomorrow, but it may pay dividends in a year or 2 years or 3 years. A lot of things like investing in yourself and building your machine learning capabilities and building your knowledge of how to do these things are things that will pay long-term dividends if you have the good sense to use them. Just like, building that relationship with that influencer, it's going to take you probably a year to get well known to an influencer. My friend Mitch Joel says this fantastically. It's not who you know, it's who knows you, right? When somebody says, "Hey, I need to talk about SEO. I'm going to talk to Kevin." Okay, it's who knows you. That relationship takes time to build, and it takes effort, and it takes a willingness to actually want to talk to these people. That's the foundation for growth, and it has to be something that you have a plan for, you invest in over the long term, which I recognize is a super challenging thing these days, because these days, we're all so focused on, this quarter, this month, this week, trying to get things done, stay afloat, keep the business running. We're in an environment now where forecasting anything beyond 2 weeks is impossible. Like, you literally have no idea what's going to happen in 2 weeks. Oh, look, massive, largest, strongest hurricane to hit the U.S. mainland ever. Like, oh, that was this week. Oh, by the way, California's still on fire. Oh, by the way, we have brand new police murders going on, in several of our cities. It's like, you can't forecast any of this stuff, but you can, and you are in control of yourself. You are in control of your own progression of what things you need to know. So one of the things I would suggest to people, I tell this to people all the time, is go to any major marketing site like Marketing Land or whatever, right? And just look at the categories in like their blog roll and ask yourself, do I know anything about this? If so, what? Do I need to know anything about this? Why? And what are the things I think are have the potential to grow in a couple of years? Should I be training myself on that now? And that gives you a blueprint, a professional development plan to invest in yourself, to say, okay, I got to learn more about email marketing. I know it's a thing. Email's not going anywhere. Everyone says email's dead. I've been saying this for the last 15 years, and yet here we are still sending email every day. What do I need to know in order to be able to make that a part of my professional development? I can't emphasize it enough. You are in control of yourself. You are in control of your professional development. What plan are you going to build for the next 2 years for yourself to learn some of these techniques?
And that's exactly how this statement arrives on my end between the lines. It's you can drive a Volvo and you can tune that Volvo up, but at some point you buy a Tesla and it's a completely different thing, right? So I was just curious, like between optimizing and let's call it innovation or new things, who do you see doing that extremely well? Who do you think invests enough, like some brands, people who invest enough in long-term growth while keeping the boat afloat?
That's a good question, and I don't have good answers for, because I see across the board companies not investing enough in people. I see people not investing enough in themselves. There are some folks, I see them a lot in my Slack group, for example, who are asking great questions. That, by the way, is the indicator of who's got the potential for growth, is by the questions they ask. People who are asking good questions, people who are asking consistently better questions, shows you they're on a path towards growth. And there are a number of folks I can't name them because they haven't given me their permission to name them. But they're in like our analytics for marketers Slack and and other Slack instances. But when I go to conferences, even virtually now, and I listen to the questions I get in the Q&A period, questions aren't different. The questions aren't better. The questions aren't showing that people are growing. What's happening is that it's sort of this bizarre turnstile or treadmill. As soon as somebody gains some proficiency, they get promoted, they bring in a new person, and the new person is starting from ground zero. There's no knowledge transfer. And so the new person goes to the conference and says, hey, what should I be doing with my keyword lists? Like, that was fine 10 years ago. But this person's brand new. They're 23 years old. They're first or second job out of university. Like, okay, so here we go again. And I don't see, and this is one of the things I think is most concerning, I don't see any kinds of events or groups or anything for the intermediate to advanced practitioners. Now, it's entirely possible that they exist and they're secret for a reason. I remember when I was doing affiliate marketing, one of the jokes was you go to Affiliate Summit and you're seeing everything that worked great last year. And absolutely no one in their right mind will tell you what's working for them right now because they need to make their money now. But there isn't enough content out there for the advanced practitioner. Like, I would say of the blogs that I read, Simo Ahava's blog on Google Tag Manager is probably one of the few that's constantly like, hey, this is advanced, deal with it.
Right.
But there's not a ton else in the marketing world. Now, there's a ton in the machine learning world, in the AI world, because a lot of it's still academic. And that's where I definitely see a lot of advancement.
Simo Ahava's blog, definitely recommendable. And I'll have all of these things in the show notes, all the people you mentioned, all the books you mentioned. Of course, tons of links to your blog, to your newsletter, to Marketing Over Coffee. And I want to wrap this up, but not before I ask you two more questions. And the first one is, in or outside of work, SEO, AI, whatever, what are you genuinely excited about right now?
Outside of work entirely, you mean?
You can pick inside work, outside work, whatever comes to mind.
So inside work, a lot of the work in things like stylometry and natural language processing, I'm doing more and more with natural language processing. I'm about to build my first recommendation engine based on stylometric stuff to say, like, hey, these are the pieces that are stylistically similar, because I want to test it out to see how that compares to what I get out of Markov chain modeling. So that's pretty cool, and it's going to be fun. I just started playing with a pre-trained music separation AI model from Dieter. You give it an MP3 file, like Taylor Swift's latest song, right? And it uses pre-trained models to split apart that file into the vocals, drums, lead instruments, and accompaniment. And it sounds good. It sounds so good. I was testing it out the other day, and I'm like, okay. What it came out with to separate the vocals from the backing track is enough that you could take the backing track and use it for karaoke, right? It's good enough. So that stuff is a lot of fun. One of my sort of inside-outside, it's an interest. It's not something I'm excited about. It's actually the exact opposite. I dread it. Is I write a daily email newsletter called Lunchtime Pandemic that is about what I see and research and curate about the pandemic. If you go to lunchtimepandemic.substack.com, you can sign up for it. I was hoping to not be doing this newsletter anymore. I was hoping, like, to be able to say in August, yeah, I'm retiring this newsletter. We've got things under control. Great. Instead, we don't. But I take content from the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, Journal of American Medical Association, Brief 19, Stat News, and I'm looking for articles that are prescriptive or that have clinical relevance. I am not in any way, shape, or form a medical professional, but I read a lot, and at 6 months of doing this, okay, I can tell this is credible, this is not. That's a preprint, that's been peer reviewed, and looking for things like, okay, this is what's likely to happen, and just in general, like stuff like that. Like we had this hurricane hit, a bunch of refineries have taken some damage and stuff, and others are restarting, but it's going to have an impact on gas prices. So yesterday I shared to folks like, hey, if you haven't already, top off your tank. If you live in North America, top off your gas tank just in case, because there's always the potential in the strong storm for shortages afterwards.
Amazing. And I can recommend everybody to check that out. The last question that I want to leave you with is, what are all the places on the internet that people can find and follow you?
So the 2 places to make it easy. My company and work, trustinsights.ai. Today's blog post, which will be up obviously forever, is on pumpkin spice data. So we took a look at 378 products that have the name pumpkin spice in the name of the product, their ingredients, their calories, etc. It's a fun data dive. So trustinsights.ai. And then for my personal stuff, just go to christopherspenn.com. Those are the 2 places. You can find everywhere else from there, but those are the places to go.
Christopher, I need to sit down for 10 minutes and digest all the information you just gave me, because that was absolutely phenomenal. I thank you very, very much for your time. Everybody go check out Christopher Penn's stuff on the internet. He's all over. His stuff is really high quality, top notch. And I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir. Have a nice day.
You too.